We have more information than any generation in history, and somehow we're more confused than ever. People are quietly asking questions they don't always say out loud. Is anything real? Is anything actually true? Can anything be trusted? Even when we say truth doesn't matter, we don't live that way. If we break our arm, we go to the ER, not the zoo. When someone says, "I'll be there," we expect them to show up. In response to a calling I had to explore truth more deeply, I reached out to a former professor of mine, Warren Edick, a self-described small village philosopher, to explore truth together. These are not lectures, they're conversations about truth, meaning, and how we live. This is the Truth Project. This is a series meant to be listened to starting with episode 1, so if you haven't yet listened to episode 1, please go back and start there. The audio in this episode is a bit rough. Please bear with us and look forward to cleaner audio on future episodes. Thank you and enjoy. Well, thanks for joining me today. In our last episode, we covered a lot of ground, talked about some aspects of truth, what it is. We talked about truth as related to trustworthiness, as important to functioning in daily life, but we also talked about this interesting situation that we're kind of in as a society where in academia, it's very common, not prominent, to claim truth does not exist. But what we've discussed is that truth, does, and everyone really lives as if it does. Even the academics who claim that truth does not exist will become flustered if you don't use their true name. And so, taking off from there, I think, be interested to know what do you think that the real impact of academia and what's being taught in the universities, how does that translate into, the real world that we're living in? And how do, specifically, how do you think academics teaching that there's no truth, how does that play out in the world that we live in today?
Disastrous. Absolutely disastrous. First off, we need to be careful here. Postmodernists will be coming in and saying, "Oh, that's not true." We're not saying that stuff like that. They don't claim per se that there is no truth. Now, you'll hear people say that in the lecture halls and so forth, but formally speaking, that's not the claim. The claim is that everybody has their own truth. So in other words, there's a multiplicity of truth on any given subject at the number of there being how many human beings there are in the world. And they're going to point that out. Okay? Of course, to a person who is critical in their thinking and who understands the basic axiomatic setup of logic, perhaps a little bit of formal logic, it falls into the same thing to say that, everybody has their own truth or there is no truth at all. It falls semantically in semantic space. It'll where the rubber meets the road end up meaning the same thing. Okay?
And so, everybody has their own truth, but when they say that everybody has their own truth, what is that word truth that they're using? And is it the same?
There you go.
Clearly
There you go. It's a subtle redefinition, reapplication of the word, of human language. Underlying a lot of postmodernity, what you will find is linguistic relativism. This nutty, naive realism idea that language came about in general just because of people agreeing that ooga ooga means, that rock over there. And everybody, consents to that. And from then on, everybody knows ooga ooga, that's the rock. And the notion here in naive realism is, this oversimplified way of thinking. Well, had the first guy said aga aga and pointed at it, and everybody agreed to that, well, then rock would be aga aga, and it's that way with all of language, which of course is utterly ignorant of the most basic ideas of what language even is. Okay, that may work for nouns, but it certainly doesn't work for logical operators, syntax, grammar, all this kind of stuff, the stuff in between. Okay, if, then, or, and, but, all of this stuff. Because what is language? It's not just a simple description. It is the sharing, or likewise the transmission, of meaning. That's what it is. So language per se is conveying something that has meaning. And what is that, right? You see? And I can't just do that with words. I can say blue, airplane, cloud, chair. Okay. Those are all descriptors. Those are all nouns. Was that meaningful? No. What does that mean? No clue. Just a string of nouns. So language is something other than just agreement on uga uga and aga aga. And in formal logic, when you get into logical operators, let's just point out the word or. You get into truth tables, and you can show deductively, that is to say with certainty, that there's a compelling meaning to these logical operators based on formal logic, based on the formalities of how the noodle works. And that's the whole thing here. To be more direct as an answer to your question or a response to your question, do we have different shifting meanings of what is truth when they say everybody has their own truth? Well, you better believe we do, because ultimately what they're saying is 1 and 1 can be whatever the hell you want it to be. Now, here's the kicker, Alex. They're not just saying that as if that weren't stupid enough, which it is. Okay? That's one thing. But in so saying, there's another claim being made that goes unspoken. And that gets at the heart of the matter of what is postmodernity. Because what they're actually saying, if I express it, if I say it out loud, is 1 and 1 can be whatever the hell you want it to be. And anyone else's conception of what that is but on equal footing. It is no better or no more true than what you say it is. And that's not merely stupid. That's egregious. Okay? Because now what you have done is you have, in essence, taken whoever buys into that and catapulted them into the year 636 BC. Why do I say that? Well, in an interview once that Einstein did, Albert Einstein, a journalist once interrupted him and said, well, how does it feel to put the last nail in the coffin of the father of science, referring to Isaac Newton? And Einstein famously interrupted him right there and said, whoa, 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 whoa. Okay, we're all just disciples. I mean, the father of all of us, referring to science and scientists, is Thales of Miletus, who lived around 635 BC. Miletus being an ancient Greek city-state in the Hellenistic world, which today would be on the coast of what today is, I believe, Turkey, if I'm correct. Yes, Turkey. And he's the first one who, in so many words, created a process, a progress, a cumulative, progressive idea where knowledge accumulates onward and upward. But here's the key to what he did, historically speaking. I mean, he is both credited as being the inventor, the discovery guy of both science and philosophy. But what did he do? He formally distinguished between knowledge and opinion. And knowledge, in Latin, of course, knowledge is scientia, where we get the English word science, is different because, now I'm going to use a word that I use in my work to describe what he was getting at, it is intersubjectively verifiable. We are subjects of knowledge, and there exists a intersubjective verifiability. You can test my work if I'm claiming it to be knowledge. You can repeat it. You can come to see it, experience it for yourself. Whoa, that is true. Okay? With an opinion, a mere opinion, that's not possible. To say 1 and 1 can be whatever the hell you want it to be, and which is implied in the postmodern idea, that is on equal footing with anyone else's idea of what that is, including the mathematicians, including the logicians, including the scientists. You see? Makes everything but an opinion, and there is no more such thing as knowledge, properly conceived. It thrusts us into 636 BC, the time period prior to Thales, which is the birthplace of philosophy and science. And that is egregious because it inevitably implies the deconstruction of the entire history of science.
So, but that can't be. I mean, so obviously there are people who are still doing science, who don't believe, in post modernity. I mean, it sounds like you really. We talked about this idea of like building things, and it sounds like science is really, you have to have something has to be true, so you can connect that to something else, and this all holds itself together. But if nothing at all can be true, and 1 + 1 = 2 or 6 or zebra, whatever you want, then you can't say, and then this, there's nothing at all to begin with there. Um, so yeah, and I think again I'd like to probe like how deep is that penetrating? I mean, are there do people who practice science, do they believe in this kind of postmodern subjectivity, or is there kind of a clean line there within the academia?
I'm giggling because you're clearly a man who implicitly, just who you are, acknowledges science. And from that perspective, that's a very good question. I mean, you said it best. There's nothing there. Okay? Postmodernity demands epistemically to hover on nothing. Okay? It is epistemological relativism, not merely moral relativism. We've seen ethical relativism before. Okay, in the Romantic period and subcultural elites in the arts and stuff like this, it pops and rears its ugly head every here and there. We've seen it at the downfall of Athens, when we get into the era of debauchery, where Mount Olympus itself, which used to be, filled with priests and meditation and a sacred ritual, had become basically a brothel, and drug use and all of that at the end of it all, where Sparta basically fell into militarism and Athens fell into debauchery at the end of the Hellenistic period. So ethical relativism is not something new. There's no objectivity in ethics. Postmodernity has brought to the mass media, the printing press, epistemological relativism. In other words, it claims knowledge itself is relative. And so if I claim to know something, 1 and 1 is 7, my knowledge is on equal footing as a mathematician's knowledge who claims 1 and 1 is 2. See, that's where we are. Okay, so again, we're at this crossroad now. The postmodernists will say there is, an infinite amount of knowledge, and on any particular subject, at least as much as there are human beings in the universe, which logically will fold into there is no knowledge at all because there's no distinction between knowledge and opinion. There we are. We're knocked out back to 636 BC, which then opens everything that has happened since like a zipper, and it deconstructs all of civilization. So it's inherently destructive. I convey to my students, but I always wonder, how deep can they sink their teeth into it without formal logical training? But if you want to deconstruct everything, which seems to be the ethos of postmodernity, at least in Western civilization, then by default you are not deconstructing, you are destructing. It is the destruction of the world. Okay, to use a religious scholar term, Van Gennep, that's a name of a religious scholar of ritual. I mean, you are unearthing the axis mundi, the axle of the world around which the entire cosmos turns in its motions day to day in an orderly way. We're pulling that axle ontologically out of existence and casting the world into chaos. Now, when you say, well, how does that work? Well, yeah, you're going to run up to that everywhere in postmodernity. You can take a simple example. We once had this rocket program in the 60s down at Cape Canaveral, right? Apollo rockets, one of them went to the moon and all that kind of stuff. And they had these cool countdowns back then when I was a kid, right? 1, take off, Well, they had rudimentary computers back then on board, right? Program that to read 1 plus 1 equals anything other than 2. Well, what happened? Well, clearly, 3, 2, 1, take off. Big explosion. Everybody's dead. No one ever flew anywhere. That's what happened. So isn't that enough evidence? Well, it could be to a rational being. Postmodernity scoffs at rationality. As a matter of fact, it's, from my perspective, our perspective, devolves to the point now we're even evoking the idea of evidence as merely you evoking white supremacy. Okay? There's many postmodern scholars out there who have defined logic and evidence as stuff the white man invented to win every argument. There you have it. That's what you're dealing with. Okay? How are you going to have a reasonable discussion there? Well, how do you have a reasonable discussion with a person who hates reason? You're not.
Yep.
You're not. And so we are pitted against our will into a position that I heard it said here lately best by someone on YouTube. I saw a person say this. This person said, if one party demands to deny reality, then compromise with that party is not possible. That's where we are. That's where we are. we would like to compromise, but there's no foothold to be had for any of that
Right.
because they're assuming the whole thing, and there's no wiggle room. I mean, to us, any kind of compromise would be us agreeing on something, just a small part of the picture that makes sense, that's reasonable. Yeah, but the person you're having this dispute with, or the movement you're having this dispute with, hates reason in and of itself, and they're not going to adhere to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems clear to me anyway that it's just a self-defeating philosophy, and why bother even teaching people this if they're what they're teaching is just as in from their position just means the same thing as anything else anybody else is saying. Why be a professor? Why have a conversation?
Very good. Exactly.
Nothing.
Exactly. The word teaching becomes meaningless. Teaching implies I'm teaching something that's true. Okay? I mean,
So
even if it's a subjective field, like playing the piano, well, there's objectivity to how you hit the keys to make it sound right, or how to copy those notes and hitting the keys. I mean, you're teaching something that's true. So why bother? And so we see this.
right.
Sadly, we see this. We see young people the world over now in Western civilization who sadly, tragically, in my humble opinion, are living in hell because they have nothing. They were inculcated, indoctrinated in this kind of a milieu wrongly through the capturing of education, inundated by postmodern impulses. If I believe this, then that's just as true as what the professor says. So, why make an effort? Why go to the library, pull an all-nighter? Why force myself if I don't want to read right now? It's just as good as if I don't read. And who are you to tell me I got a D instead of an A plus? What is this? I mean, and if you walk through life like that as a young person, you have no foothold available to you into anything that is meaningful, that is building, as in a building block. And that can be behind your eyeballs as well as in the front. Character development is a building of some kind. I figure out truth in my inner heart or in morality, and I accumulate more piece by piece, and that develops into a composition. I compose myself so as to stand well to complete my sentence, as we should all speak in complete sentences. After all, we've all been given a death sentence. That's what this world is. Make no mistake. Back to the great American poet, no one gets out of here alive. And I want to do that with composure. I have to compose myself. I have to stand on something. Do you want to build a relationship? You want to build a marriage? You want to build a parenthood? You want to build a life, as we call it, for you and those whom you love? Or I can try to build something on the outside. I want to build a career. I want to build credit. I want to build this, that, or the other. There's an army of young people, our young people, who have been robbed of the very ability to build anything. I mean, there's an all-time high in our country of people in their 20s and 30s, you know, living at home with their in the basement of their parents, playing video games, living off of whatever the government may hand out and they can get their hands on. Who would be able to work, but I got this, that, or the other, and everybody has something. It's unbelievable. But what's at the root of it? Where's the idea of building something when there's so many impulses from their smallest childhood up into the relativization? It's totally relative. What is knowledge? Relative. What is meaning? All of this flatlines, and you're left just breathing. And I see this hunger in my classroom. I see this hunger in students. I see it even in adult students. Most of my work is adult education at the university. I see that, and then I see that occasionally. Thank goodness, it makes my life, my work meaningful. In every course, and I've taught hundreds and hundreds of university courses, but in every one, there's one or two where all of a sudden, unexpectedly, the light goes on as if they found a foothold that just never existed. Something is, whoa, I can latch something on that, and wow, I could build something. Something can grow. That's meaningful. And they light up. It's therapeutic. Find a way to bring meaning into your life. And that's what it is. Ultimately, that's what it is. It's a pearl of great price. We struggle for meaning. Meaning is a struggle. According to Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor. Yeah, so there's a lot going on here. So what does that mean? Politically, what does that mean for the soul and heart and well-being and mental health of people? The generations who knew nothing other than these impulses of postmodernity everywhere. It's destructive, it's dismal, it's tragic, it's dark. And ultimately, it's a lie. That's what it is. It is deception, encroaching on conception. That's what it is. And if that doesn't have a moral character, then I don't know what does.
Definitely, it seems clear. Purpose and truth, are interrelated substantially. I know last, we talked about, truth as being trustworthy. Now we're talking about truth as maybe informing purpose. So we're kind of starting to point, kind of frame this image of what truth is in a few different directions. And yeah, I think maybe we'd like to explore that a little bit more. Truth. So truth is can be facts. Facts are a type of truth, right? And a fact is basically, it would be a statement that corresponds with that which is in reality. Is that accurate from your perspective as a philosopher?
You're broaching a huge topic here, which we could explore. I mean, if you want to. I mean, it's a big topic you're exploring. What you just broached is one of the big words here in the 20th century, which is correspondence. Okay? Formal logic, that is to say, formal logic in the proper sense, which entails semantic space. So this is the way Thales started formalizing what is the human noodle. He started by saying, what is this? That we can, have a sense of what's coming, either over that mountain or this, that, and the other, without seeing it first. We can use our noodle to figure stuff out. No other animals are able to do that. Hitherto, nothing in the known universe is able to do that. What is that? And so he started formalizing logic, these logical moves, which became, of course, known as the inferential laws of deduction. Okay? Law of implication and all this kind of stuff. Modus ponens, modus tollens, all this kind of stuff. That's where it began. Okay? And in formal logic, semantic space is part of the deal where you have meaning in language and you move around propositions, and you create arguments where an argument is, a structured set of propositions of which one and only one is purported to follow from the others. And that one is then the conclusion, the others are the premise, and all this kind of stuff. The anatomy of science. In that, but also, I can remove semantic space from it and approach it merely quantitatively. Okay? That then is what commonly is referred to as mathematics. That's what that is. A formal deductive inferential law without the semantic dimension of human meaningfulness. Sure, I still have meaning as to the variables, X, Y, Z, this, that, and the other, but it's still all quantitative. Okay? That field is based on what we call coherence. And so I have ideas behind my eyeballs, and they need to cohere with each other. So I have a bag, and I'm looking at X, and the law of implication allows me to say, well, in that bag there's X too, and that there's a coherence between two ideas. What you broached is the topic of correspondence. Now I have two things that are not same, like two ideas. I'm dealing with something behind my eyeballs and something in front of my eyeballs. Behind my eyeballs is the world of ideas. In front of my eyeballs is the world of facts. And if I try to positively align and say, oh, that aligns an idea with a fact, that's called correspondence. So I have coherence theory, formal logic, and I have correspondence theory, which gives me the empirical realm. Okay? Postmodernity latches wholeheartedly on to something that happened in the 20th century. That is as nutty as it gets, Alex. And that is the misinterpretation and misrepresentation of a big buzzword that, using it alone in the 20th century, imbues people with some sort of special status. And that buzzword is quantum physics. Okay. It's in quantum physics that we have learned that correspondence theory breaks down. Okay? In other words, in quantum physics, I can observe something, a fact, right? But the knowledge I can gain about that fact, in other words, the idea that I'm trying to correspond to that fact, right, is created by me observing that fact. In other words, that fact wouldn't exist as I'm observing it when I'm not observing it. Does that make sense? Do you see what I'm trying to say? Okay? In
I
other
think
words,
so.
think of a subatomic fractional particle of some kind. Think of it, I'm going to give an oversimplified example. Its particular tangent, placement, velocity, okay, is a product of me observing it. I'm not observing it in what traditionally in the atomic and above level would be its natural environment. It was not doing what it's doing prior to me observing it. So whatever I'm observing the effect of me observing it. You see, this is where correspondence theory breaks down. Because I don't have a true correspondence between what I'm observing and the idea of that thing. Because the
Yeah,
idea of that thing is how it is, let's use the word, dangerous word here at the deeper level, but how it is in and of itself. Like, I can unobtrusively observe an animal in its natural habitat. It doesn't know it's being observed. Now I have correspondence theory. Look at that. Okay, I can have ideas that correspond to how that thing behaves without anyone ever studying it. Not so when I get into quantum physics.
and
And then this
so
is
I'm
then where
familiar
the
with like,
craziness begins.
yes, you have like double slit experiment. You've got uh, basically once you observe the light, it's kind of in nature doing its thing, and then you start recording it, and they say that collapses the wave function, and now you're seeing a particle, whereas like maybe light in nature on its own is a wave, but as soon as we start looking at things, they become particularized, and that sounds like
Right.
that's outside of kind of their nature. That's an interesting idea. How does that tie back then? Does it, I mean, in some sense I could see how that can undermine, correspondence theory and just knowledge. I think people could run with that and say, hey, nothing really is what it seems. You can't trust anything that you see.
Correct. It's become vogue in the 20th century for pseudo intellectuals and pop scientists and scientists who just want to make a name for themselves by tapping into popular opinions, um, to say that reality is not really based on anything. Okay? Because it's basically tortoise shells all the way down, and there is no bottom to the all the way down. Okay? It's not like it ends somewhere and there's solid reasoning and correspondence. Nope. Nope. You get into quantum physics and whoom, it just whoom. And so nothing is really real. That chair here, this microphone isn't really real because, I can get into the subatomic level of its makeup and, it's all kinds of things, I mean, I'm running into stuff down there that can be in two places at the same time. I'm running into, let's use a formal word, indetermination. I have left what is called the Newtonian universe. The problem, however, Alex, is twofold, and it's really a political impetus. The other problem that happened in the 20th century is the lack of this basic, and this is not complicated, not deep, basic education. Okay? Basic education. Let me give you an example. Okay? And you can tell me whether that's something, you've learned in middle school. Because you should have. You should have. A sane society would teach that. Okay? Aristotle is walking along a meadow and the wind picks up. And as the wind picks up and blows against his face, he sees knee deep grass doing this. Him being who he is, a philosopher, right? He's always lost in thought. And he's like, what is that? I'm not taking anything for granted, What is that? I mean, I can do that. I can do that. Watch this. I can do that. But that's me intending to do it. There's a will behind my eyeballs, and I've decided to do that. Does the grass do that? Does the grass have a will and it decided to do that and magically communicated with all the other grass to do it at the same time? So all of a sudden he starts writing about, he tries to capture what he calls the law of motion. He reasons, no, there's no will in grass, not the kind that I'm speaking of. There was something that came from the outside of grass and it pushed it that way. We call it wind, earth, wind, and fire. These are the kinds of categories the ancient Greeks liked. Okay? So he realized, you know what? There's something that pushed it. And he starts outlining, right, in his law of motion, what then later on in the Renaissance and following that, Francis Bacon, all this kind of stuff, becomes what we today call the law of causation. Okay? That I have an antecedent event, right, and an effect, okay, and a posterior event, right? Think of two dominoes, and if one falls and pushes that one, well, then it falls, and so this happens first. It's the antecedent event. We then, in modern days, call that the cause. This is the posterior event to the antecedent event. We then call that the effect. I have cause and effect, and I'm walking into what is Newtonian thought and Newtonian thinking, all the way into the first law of thermodynamics, conservation of energy, all this kind of stuff. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
And Aristotle reasons this out. Well, then, if the grass bent because the wind blew, what made the wind blow? Okay, where did the world come from? Where did I come from? Well, Aristotle's a smart guy. He realized 9 months before I was born, my parents, hubba hubba, got it, okay. 9 months before they were born, their parents, hubba hubba, got it. Cause and effect. Of course, he didn't call it that. He's thinking of it as in trying to figure out, being the scientist he is, a philosopher, how can I explain motion? Because everything's in motion in this world, apparently. And so he reasons backwards, cosmologically, and arrives in his writing at this amazing phrase, an unmoved mover. Okay, somewhere, something must have moved without having been moved. Well, it's like, whoa, that's like sort of magical, man. That's miraculous. I mean, I'm not able to find anything in front of my eyeballs in this here world that behaves like that. Surely I am not. Okay? So what is that? Well, an unmoved mover, I mean, similar to me grabbing a shoelace and holding it up here, right? And now I'm going to pull myself up. And have you go, surely that'd be something to behold, wouldn't it? Yeah, that'd be wild, wouldn't it? Okay, unmoved mover. Later on, then, St. Augustine, Augustinus Aurelius, other people, St. Thomas of Aquinas in particular, grabs a hold of unmoved mover and uses it as, if you will, a scientific synonym for what is called God. Okay? What Aristotle realized, and he realized it with certainty because it's a deductive analysis, okay, formally known, okay, as cosmogony. Okay, it's a subset of what is generally referred to as St. Thomas of Aquinas' cosmological argument. But formally, it's the cosmogonic argument. Okay, goni means birth in ancient Greek. The birth of the cosmos, the birth of existence as such, the world. Where did it come from? And we can go down this road, and I can show you it is intersubjectively verifiable, deductively, that no matter how you conceive of it, and we can exhaust all possible options, you're looking at something that cannot be explained with cause and effect. It's not going to work. You're looking at an uncaused event, which is science vernacular for what common folk refer to as miracle. Okay? You're staring at it if you're going to think about the beginning of the world, the ultimate beginning. Where did it, I mean, okay? Because even if the world has always been, well, then what caused it to be? Okay? If it has always been, why then nothing caused it to be. And if nothing caused it to be, that's the very definition of what is an uncaused event. Or it started somewhere out of nothing. Well, that's also an uncaused event. You can go on and on, okay? Aristotle understood that if I go into the macrocosm, I will inevitably, with deductive, logical certainty, encounter indetermination. You're going to run into indetermination, that which is not determined by cause and effect, by the laws of motion. You know what I'm saying? Okay. Now, there was a man called Democritus in ancient Greece, a student, a disciple of Leucippus. This is around, let's call it roughly 400 BC. Okay? 380, maybe. And there's some people who claim Democritus was the literary invention of Leucippus, so the work should be attributed to Leucippus, who was a real chap in my tradition of the ancient philosophers. We know that. But, you know, most people are inclined to think he had a student, his name was Democritus. He did a formal logical analysis the other way around. Okay? And the way he did that is he said, well, let's take that chair there, grab a sword, let's half that chair. Theoretically, can I do that? Sure. Blow it in half. All right, let's pick up one of them halves of the chairs, put it on the table, grab my sword, half that, and then take that half and half it, and then that half and half it and half it and half it and half it. It's going to get real small. At a certain point, I can't half it because my sword is too big. Well, hypothetically, let's say I can have an infinitely small sword, cutting device. Let's continue that logical thought. And down he goes, halving it and halving it and halving it and halving it. And this chap discovered deductively in what Aristotle himself calls a sound argument, meaning it has all true premises and a valid, a correct logical inference to the conclusion. That if that process could go on infinitely, it would violate the law of non-contradiction. Now, the actual argument then somehow made its way in forms of scrolls, I believe, to Alexandria, where at that time Aristotle was in charge of the library. I might mark some of it up, but if memory serves. Anyway, Aristotle read it and understood, yes, Democritus is correct with certainty. If I go into the infinitely small, which they then called, these are all Greek words, the microcosm, there too, I will inevitably at some point encounter indetermination, just like if I go into the macrocosm and I'm staring at an unmoved mover. Okay? They knew that. Now, the exact work of Democritus apparently was lost in the big fire of the Library of Alexandria. All we know is Aristotle's words that it's a sound argument. And Aristotle being arguably one of the greatest logicians ever, there you have it. Anyway, what did it spawn in that area of the Hellenistic world where Leucippus and Democritus lived? It spawned a great subfield of philosophy where many disciples, philosophers who entered into that field were known as the Atomists, the atomistic school of philosophy, which was born around 385 before Christ. And this leads all the way into the school of Epicurus, who himself came up and was trained in the atomistic school of philosophy. The academy did not come through entirely and studied and collected all the work of all philosophers. Okay, Plato's academy, but both Plato and Aristotle resisted the claims of atomistic philosophy, not the claim that you will reach indetermination, not the claim that atoms exist. Imagine that. But the claim that that's all that exists. Aristotle and Plato are famously dualists. Okay? Which then later on we know dualism is not a thing. We can get into that. Okay? Monism is a thing. But how that works out is very interesting. Anyway, back to our topic. Okay? It was Democritus who logically discovered the atom. Now, empirically, it was also discovered. And that happened roughly 200 years ago, 150 years ago, something like that. Okay? But almost 2,500 years prior, it was discovered logically. And there is not even a word in the English language for atom. Imagine that. Kids could be taught this stuff. It's pretty straightforward. Okay? We just use the word that Democritus gave it because it's ancient Greek. We're using ancient Greek. Okay? It's the atom. What is a? Well, what does it mean to be a theist? Alex, what does that mean?
Believe in God. Believe in the
Yeah,
existence
you believe
of
in God. Okay, so from theos, ancient Greek, God. What does it mean to be an atheist?
You do not believe. The
There
opposite.
you go. The prefix a in the ancient Greek language is the negation. Tom. And tom is the root noun of the ancient Greek word tomero, or the ancient Greek verb tome. Tomero means the division. Tome means to divide. Remember, Democritus dividing this stuff with his imaginary sword all the way down the line, smaller and smaller, right?
Mm-hmm.
Atom literally is ancient Greek and means that which is not to be divided. That which is not to be divided. What did they mean by that? A lot of people jump in here and say, yeah, well, we split the atom, so surely, in the 20th century, we can divide it, Well, that's not exactly what they meant by that. What they meant is that the world that the human being lives in, I, in my work, refer to it as the human condition, the empirical world of the human condition. Things are particular. I mean, needless to say, you're Alex, I'm Warren. Two different particular people. See that? But what they meant formally back then was, look at this mouse. It's particular for a particular reason. Namely, see that right there? It has a beginning. And it has an end.
Mm-hmm.
It has a beginning and it has an end. It is different than the apeiron. Now we're going back to the disciples of Thales, the first generation disciples, where you run into Anaximander and Anaximenes, The apeiron is a word in the ancient Greek language which describes that which has no beginning and no end. And it was Anaximander who forwarded the metaphysical idea that that's where the elements come from. And the elements, of course, are earth, wind, and fire, stuff like that. We're just starting out. But the real grandiosity of Thales and Anaximander was that they spoke of elements, even though we know them not to be earth and wind and fire. But by doing so, what they created was, let's find the correct description of elements and put them on a table. See, this is the beginning of it all. The beginning of science and philosophy. Let's have a table. Let's put elements on there. Think about it. That's where that comes from. Now we're 635 before Christ. Anyway, that's what it means for something to be particular. It has a beginning and an end. So Lego pieces can be made smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until you reach what Democritus around 385 BC calls verbatim the atom. Okay? If you want to go smaller than that, things may no longer have a beginning and an end. You will enter the realm of indeterminacy. They knew that. We knew that 2,500 years ago. Yet a whole army of people in the 20th century run around fancying themselves oh so smarty pants because the world never knew that. But now we know that if I go below the atom into subatomic quantum physics stuff, well, there's indetermination, and it is even just unspokenly presupposed by everybody that no one knew that before, and so relativism is now established. This was common knowledge already 2,500 years ago, that if you go below whatever the atom is, they didn't know it was hydrogen, oxygen, this, that, and the other, but they knew there would be one. They knew there would be one. And just look at the beauty of what they already knew. Thales, knowledge, not opinion. I go below the atom, I find just on the first level. I don't even have to go way down. I can just go into protons, neutrons, and electrons. Now look at an electron. What is that? Does it have a beginning and an end? No. Now, you get into whole nomenclature confusion in subatomic physics because you have so much hubris in 20th century physicists on this idea that they discovered something new. Conceptually, sure, you discovered these kinds of things and what they are, and they didn't know that, and they didn't know the charge of an electron and this and that, but they knew that somewhere you're going to reach an end to what they considered having beginning and an end, particular. And if you go below that, things are no longer corresponding. So look at an electron on one of its levels around the proton and neutron. And what we find, is a misrepresentation in high schools and middle schools where it's misrepresented as some styrofoam little ball, around the big ball of balls, red and whatever, blue. And you got the white ones out there. But it's not a ball because that little ball has a beginning and an end. It's a charge. It's a real charge. It really exists. It's a real empirical fact, an electron. Yeah. But it's an energy signature that I can represent on a bell curve. And what's notable about a bell curve is that it never hits the x-axis, no matter how far out I go. So whatever instrument I use to measure where the electron is and where it is not, I'm going for the peak of the bell curve energy thing, and I know that's the electron. And now when I want to measure where it is not, like over here, that's the calibration of that instrument I'm using. Because if I use a stronger one, I can still read that signature, that energy signature on the bell curve further out. So I'm just pragmatically putting it there as opposed to having a concrete beginning and an end. And you're going to get into all kinds of stuff down there. It's indetermination. But the Greek philosophy already knew this 2,500 years ago. Hence, what they all agreed upon, Aristotle, Democritus, Leucippus, Plato, is that what we're dealing with, what we call reality, and this is the term they use, is the mesocosm. The mesocosm, according to them, is the space in between the macrocosm and the microcosm. I, in my work, refer to that as our human condition. Our human condition exists. What is the mesocosm? I don't exist in some heavenly realm of unmoved movers and being able to pull myself up on my shoelace just because I hold it up in the air. I do not exist in the subatomic quantum physical level of hypothetical and hypermathematical stuff. When I refer to reality, the real world, I'm always referring to the mesocosm. And so for all practical purposes, in our human condition, you're damn right 1 and 1 is 2, and that's a mouse, and that's a chair. And if you do it right, that rocket flies up into outer space and comes back home because you're being truthful. Well, you've programmed it to recognize 1 and 1 is 2. And that is true, irrespective of the indetermination thereof in the macrocosm or the microcosm. This issue was settled 2,500 years ago already. And it was a no-brainer to any philosopher or scientist who came ever since prior to the 20th century. Now, have you been taught that in middle school? You should have, okay? Because that'll prevent people from running around thinking, oh, we're so smart now. We have quantum physics. It's all turtles all the way down. Nothing is real. Reality doesn't exist. Just because they're incapable and have never been taught to make a distinction between the micro, the macro, and that in between, which is where reality happens. That is our human condition where we live our life. And it is oh so much joyful, meaningful, and pleasant if we keep that as a cosmos instead of casting it into chaos. These are just basic ideas. I mean, stuff that Newton knew when he was probably 7 years old. What happened to education? There's nothing to be had by the army of young people I have met and adults in my lifetime who engage me saying, well, I studied some quantum physics and, we do know blah, 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 meaning it's all tortoise shells and there is no bottom to it and therefore nothing is really real. You're trying to take the word reality and make it encompass the macrocosmic and the microcosmic. And that's a mistake from the beginning. Because what we're talking about is our human condition. What does that mean? It means that's the only realm where I ought expect, where I can, by its very inception and conception, have correspondence. That's what the correspondence method is, followed by the inductive logical method given to us by Aristotle, Okay? And coherence, same with coherence. The deductive method, all of that happens and applies singularly to the mesocosm. That is what we mean by reality. And losing track of that, you've cast yourself into indeterminacy. And you are already misusing language to the effect that inadvertently it'll all end in nothingness and relativism. And there's nothing smart about people telling me that, oh, well, quantum physics has shown us that, this doesn't really exist. That's buffoonery. I'm back into an exercise of stupidity based on ignorance, the total lack of basic education as to this tremendous adventure we call philosophy and science that put us on a course to boldly go where no one has ever gone before. And we've been on that trip for 2,500 years, onward and upward. And admittedly, there's false positives. So it works as in 2 steps up, 1 step down, 2 steps up, 1 step down. That's the autocorrect. Oh, they did get it wrong. What they thought was right. That wasn't right anyway. They got to correct it. See, you got this little curve, but all over that curve is going onward and upward in the accumulative process of knowledge, scientia. And that's an astonishingly wonderful thing, as it appears that our ability to know is built into the mesocosm, built into the human condition. The 20th century has been tremendously unkind to all of us, conceptually speaking. What are your thoughts when you hear this? Like you just said, well, I never heard that in middle school. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's kind of still processing, digesting a little bit. I think one thing I've thought is just do they even teach? There's things there's things that are true. There's things that are false. Here's what I don't even know if that's is that taught in school? Is that even that basic? Let alone just getting into the history and the kind of scientific method and the base of knowledge that's been developing in the last well millennia. Um, yeah, I think I'm just trying to kind of process this mesocosm, the in between. That's really reality. And there's the macrocosm, which let's say is everything bigger, and microcosm, everything kind of smaller level. And I'm just trying to wrap my head around how does that all tie in? How does that relate to truth? Um, that's kind of my initial reactions. I think it's very interesting, and I think it's uh, concerning and mind blowing in the sense that how far we've kind of strayed from things that were discovered 2,600 years ago roughly, and have really I think one thing that's interesting is as far as I understand the idea of let's just call it truth, the idea of a thesis and antithesis, that something's true, the opposite of that is false by definition, was basically commonly understood and accepted by people. I mean, maybe even taken for granted, or whereas, today that's changed, and people don't think of, truth in that way. And so I don't know. I mean, it seems like that's all kind of connected together, but I'm not sure right now how to piece it. But
Of course it is. Of course it is. And then we had this enormous hubris come because of it. Many physicists early on in the 20th century, many, not all, but many, latched on the popular, pop scientific fascination of all of this, fueled that toward the end of there being a 20th century stereotype embodied by the majority of physicists, namely, that they're the ones who are the ultimate authority on what it is that is to be considered real in human life. I mean, that's the ultimate arrogance. It's like, yeah, all philosophers, philosophy is dead kind of stuff. All poets, all theologians, all literary giants, uh, none of them have any actual contribution to make on what humanity ought to consider to be real. That is the reductionism of science, reductio ad absurdum, reducing the human condition and science to one subfield of a subfield only. Okay? I mean, science encompasses both the rational and the empirical. Okay? And as given to us by the great William James, in addition to that, we have the pragmatic, if it accords with the rational and the empirical. And so, one subfield of science is the empirical. Okay? And one subfield of that subfield happens to be physics. And to run around thinking that that's the ultimate authority on what is to be considered real in our human condition is a grave enough error. That
Yeah.
is mainstream pseudo knowledge throughout the 20th century.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one potential connection or one just thought that I have here is, I mean, science, like you said, empirical. I mean, maybe you can show it through, repeated experiment, I think is one thing that maybe that would be, scientific knowledge or
And then because of it,
empirical.
you have obvious elephants in the room. If you're going to be that nutty in reductionism and all that, just to run around fancy yourself the smartest man in the room because you happen to be a physicist as opposed to anything else. And my God, that's not true for many physicists, but the field at large, its culture in the 20th century has had that market element. If you're going to do that, then the careful thinkers, old school thinkers, there's going to be obvious footholds for attack. Okay? For example, and you can go on YouTube. I mean, it's wonderful. This is one of my pet projects in life. Okay, and I've done this on each account in hundreds of different versions. I have never failed in my life as a philosopher when I meet a mathematician, or likewise when I meet a physicist, to ask them because it's just my pet peeve. And I've asked hundreds on either side. And this is just, to me, a glaring elephant in the room that obviously should be pointed out. If we want to be that nutty, I'll point out the nuttiness. Is mathematics invented or is it discovered? Now, let's make no mistake. A solid 99% plus. Heck, a solid 99% plus of mathematicians I've ever asked immediately, like shooting out of a gun, say, why it's discovered, obviously. I mean, else it would be just an art, like it's, Pythagoras liked how his theorem looked. He could have written it differently. It looks nicer. Let's do that. Like a picture. make no mistake, a solid 95% plus of all physicists I ever asked immediately say it's an invention of the human mind.
Hmm.
What I've also learned is that those two groups, they scarcely ever talk to each other about that.
Hmm.
About 90% plus in both groups have never entertained the question prior to me asking them over the decades. Here recently, I saw it become kind of a thing in this century on YouTube. You know, they're doing Nobel laureates and, you know, big mathematicians given, you know, interviewing them on exactly that question. Same result. Same result. It's like, well, wait a minute. Math is just an invention, and we could have invented it differently, couldn't we? Just like a picture. I mean, a painter can paint a bridge, and sure, he could have painted it differently. Of course. That's all that is, really. So you have
So,
this dichotomy that just stands there as an elephant throughout the 20th century. Physicists all full of themselves, math is an invention. Mathematicians, it's self-evident to them that it's a discovery. And here you have that hubris, just a side effect of that hubris. To me, it's just an elephant in the room. Obviously, if you're going to reduce it down to a subfield of a subfield being the monopoly on what is to be considered real and the rest is to be looked down upon and smirked and laughed about, well, then clearly only the empirical is real and the rational, the logical, well, that's not really science. You've excluded that from science. Of course it's science. Of course mathematics is part of what we call science. Of course it is. Of course. Pythagoras or whoever it may have been, there is some circumstantial evidence that this was discovered perhaps 1000 BC in Kerala, the southwesternmost province of the subcontinent of India. But let's call it the Pythagorean theorem. You know, he doesn't need his senses. He's not using correspondence theory. I can blindfold Pythagoras and lock him in a cave. Pitch dark. That doesn't stop him from going about his work. He's working in coherence theory. He's entertaining ideas, finding how they cohere with each other. And when he discovers the behavior of perpendicular triangles, I mean, what he's discovering there is a law. If it were invented, then it started existing only then, when he wrote it down. Being discovered means the law, not the symbols used to write it down, but that lawfulness existed somehow prior to being discovered as a universal lawfulness. Somehow things like this are baked into the cosmos, or likewise our human condition. Okay? Here we get into some real questions, Alex. Real questions, not fake questions. Real questions, which will drive both mathematicians and physicists on average mad. Okay? But a philosopher will find this very interesting. If I get into coherence theory laws, these are correspondence theory laws, right? Gravity, this, that, and the other, right? Natural laws of the universe. You get into coherence laws, let's call it the binomials or the Pythagorean theorem, and we apprehend it as having been discovered, not invented, like a painter painting a picture. could have painted it differently. That law, having existed prior to being discovered, and not existing in correspondence per se, so as to be observed or touched or weighed. The interesting question now is where? Where does such a thing exist if it doesn't grow on a tree, yet has existed prior to being discovered?
Mm-hmm.
These are real questions. Smart people, we could be learning about starting middle school, have asked this question throughout the history of science and philosophy, and rightfully so. Plato asked it and answered that question by evoking what Plato calls the world of form. Augustinus Aurelius asked that question, St. Augustine, and called these laws ideas principales, which is Latin and means those are original ideas. Original meaning they existed long before human beings ever discovered them. Yet they are ideas, not facts, which grows on trees. They don't. Well, where does an idea exist if it doesn't exist in the human mind? Carl Gustav Jung asked that question and knocked on the door. Didn't go quite as deep, if you will, but he's a psychologist, not a philosopher. He nonetheless asked the question and answered it by evoking archetypal ideas and a collective unconsciousness. I, in my work, refer to it as semantic space, as opposed to physical space. And to a guy like me, semantic space is more real than is physical space, although both undoubtedly make up reality, which is nothing other than our human condition, the mesocosm. The 20th century deemed questions like that verboten. Okay? You were ridiculed if you're going to ask a question like that. Why? Because physicists have zero patience for anything like that. In fact, they charged one of their own, Stephen Hawking, to write it out plain in his book, The Grand Design, chapter 2, if memory serves, that philosophy is dead. That, to my mind, the last grasp of a dying giant in the 20th century pretending to still be alive, when in fact it's been decades that physics has stagnated and is just playing patty cake in string theory and unending mathematics without bringing anything to the table for decades. That's usually the effect of hubris, a dead end. Knowledge seems to require something called humility. And science requires community. A community of co-equals who respect, search for, and on occasion find what we call truth.
Well, that's quite a journey through the kind of the whole wide variety of different ideas.
It's our civilization. We're just surfing one way through the other, diving in here, diving out there. It's us. This is the backdrop of who we are as a civilization. This is us. And it's all under attack toward an end of total annihilation by what is postmodernity. That's what that is. And so I will say it again and again. Postmodernity is not merely an epoch amongst epochs. We can go through the hippie period, we can go through this, we can go through that, the Romantic, the Baroque, the Gothic, these are all epochs. And they all come and they go in one way or the other. They come into fashion and go back out. Postmodernity is something else. It seeks destruction and annihilation wholesale. And it's not at all clear to many a great mind how to get out of it, or if there even is such a thing. I believe there is. And one thing to my mind is clear, that into which we would coming out of it, will be intrinsically different than anything we had before. Though will contain the important elements, if we succeed, of the whole story, which is all part and parcel of the greatest story ever told. It's an adventure. Go where no one has ever gone before.
Awesome. Well, yeah. Thanks for taking the time again today to dive deep in all these ideas and just keep unpacking truth and just kind of riding this conversational wave and adventure with me. This is exciting and yeah, a lot to unpack there. I think again, our circumstances are dire to a degree, and I think this project is partly a sounding of the alarm, to anyone who's listening of, if
Good for you. Yes.
we don't want to lose meaning, we don't want to lose purposefulness. If we proceed down that path, we're going to end up in hell, in your words, with where nothing means anything, nothing can grow, nothing. There's no life, there's no purpose, and yeah, we can. I think, yeah, like you said, nobody really knows the answer, or like can the academy be restored and revived and kind of healed of these ideas that are just really blatantly destructive and harmful to individuals and to our society as a whole. And yeah, just recognizing truth and latching on to something that we can know and we can build on and we can share and just, yeah, I think is important. And yeah, just understanding, and I think we'll continue to dive more and more into it, understanding how that's unfolded, in the scientific, history, but also in philosophy and in art and all these different ways, and how that's kind of led us to the state that we're in is very interesting. And yeah, I hope that this will encourage people to talk about these things, to talk to their children about these things, to think about these things.
We should all start talking. We should all start talking. Each at their station. It matters not whether you're a university professor or whether you go out of the house in the morning and clean public restrooms for a living. It matters not. Start talking. Start talking. That's right. That's right. And try to be as honest as you can when talking. And just let the chips fall where they may. We have to all start talking. That's exactly it, Alex. That's
Okay.
exactly it.
Well, Warren, thank you for taking time to talk with me in this today and in this project and as a whole. And I hope we can keep provide something valuable to people listening, and even if it's just example of talking and sharing ideas and this idea of argumentation, putting ideas out and whittling them down to really find something valuable and meaningful out of it. So thank you again for your time in that and with me and just your investment in that across your life. And um, it's an honor to be here with you.
Blessings to you, brother.
All right. Thanks, Warren. Till next time.